Thank you for joining us for the 2022 Chautauqua program. My name is Sophia Thornblad, and I'm the Executive Director of the Horatio Colony Museum and Nature Preserve here in Keene. We are delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Keene Public Library for the first time since 2019. Chautauqua is a community-based cultural and social movement that started in the 1870s and flourished in the United States until the mid-1920s. During this time, there existed hundreds of touring Chautauquas that presented lectures, dance, music, drama, and other forms of cultural enrichment. As you may or may not know, Chautauqua programs have been coming to Keene for a long time, the first being held in 1914. Our founder, Horatio Colony II, attended these programs when he was a teenager. During its peak years, Chautauqua brought some 30 events to the city each year, and they would be held in a tent near the rear of the Washington Street High School building. After its decline in the 1920s, Chautauqua was reborn as a public humanities program in 1976. Today's Chautauquas feature scholars portraying significant historical figures in first-person performances, which will be followed by a question and answer period with the character, during which questions will be answered in the voice and the time of the character. After that, you'll be able to ask questions of the scholar, who is able to answer the questions that the character could not or would not answer. Today's speakers are Dr. James Armstead as Booker T. Washington and Rebecca Jimerson as Ida B. Wells. At this time, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. We ask that there be no photography, videotaping, or texting during today's performances. This year's program is made possible by the Friends of the Keene Public Library with a generous American Rescue Plan Humanities Grant for Libraries, an initiative of the American Library Association, made possible with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. It is my pleasure to introduce Gail Zachariah, the Head of Engagement and Youth Services at the Keene Public Library.
Hello, I just want to welcome everyone and say that in addition to the grant provided us some funds, in addition to the speaker fees and all the associated costs to improve a bit the sound and filming capabilities. So one thing we are doing with this program, there's a camera in the back that it's filming things. It's an automatic camera. There's a camera, someone monitoring it over here so that it's being live streamed and it will be taped. And your friends who are not with us today, because still people are not really coming out as much as they did. We know that this program, we haven't had Chautauqua here since 2019. That was 3 years ago. But then, unfortunately, we had 3 years when we didn't have Chautauqua either because they were renovating this night's hall. So it's been a while, and it will take us a while to build this program back up. But it's really important, I feel, because it brings first-person perspective on other people, places, and times that really nothing else does. So right now, I want you to go back to 1915. It's November 1st, 1915. And our speaker this afternoon, Booker T. Washington, he's on a fundraising tour of the Northeast. His doctors have advised a few days rest from his travels, and he remembered passing through Keene some years ago. He was here then in 1911. And he gave a speech in Concord, I believe, and many people from Keene went to it. He says he has always wanted to return to Keene, and this was a good opportunity he discovered only this morning by a parishioner while attending services at a local church that this was going on, and he asked if he could come say a few words to our townsfolk, and I agreed. So welcome, Mr. Washington.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Please excuse me if I seem a little tired. I have had a long train journey, and the doctors tell me I should get a few days rest before I go on to New York. I understand some of you find New Yorkers somewhat tiring yourselves. Well, I have stopped in Keene a few days. I remember it from earlier travels. It's a lovely town, and it's my pleasure to be here. It's my pleasure to be in New Hampshire. When I was here before, I gave a talk in Concord to the National Education Association. I'm a teacher, as you know, and of course, I talk about education in my travels. I typically discuss practical education. That is the education that prepares students who are going to become teachers to teach practical subjects, to prepare their students in normal schools to be workers, to be business people, to have practical application of their skills so that they can be enjoyed by the students as they go on in their lives. Not necessarily to study subjects which would not be particularly useful. Now, I enjoy particularly being in New Hampshire because you are one of the original states. Your motto, I was reminded, live free or die, when I was here before, I like very much. I like it. It's unequivocal. It's concise. It's clear. It leaves no room for escaping to allow one to tarnish the reputation of how you feel about freedom. I can appreciate that. As you know, my biography was entitled Up from Slavery, and it's about my personal struggle. It's about Tuskegee, the school where I was principal and now serve as president. We are declared ourselves a college. And we too understand the meaning of freedom. The title of that book, and I've written 14, but the title of that book is not only the biographical title, it's my story. I was born a slave. I think in April 1856, I don't know for sure, because records were not kept of slave births. That was not a particularly important matter on a plantation. But by deducing from the season and things that were going on, I celebrate on the 5th of April. But I cannot be sure. I have no records. There is no certainty that that was either the day or the year because of that status. 9 years I was a slave. 9 years. And I remember in 1865, the day that freedom came in Harper's Ford, Virginia. It was a day that was celebrated particularly by my mother. She talked about freedom when I was a young boy. She talked about wanting to live until the day freedom came. Well, it did come, and there was great celebration, but there was not a great understanding among the African population of America what freedom would bring. You see, freedom was the opportunity for Americans who were not Black to work where they chose, to choose their professions, to become part of the body politic. Well, that was not the case among the freedmen. After you were free, you were loosened from the plantation or the station or the factory where you had worked, but you had no money, you had no education, many had no particular profession or trade or skill and would have to find their way in this new world. Freedom was an experiment. Freedom was dangerous because there was oppression in freedom. The Ku Klux Klan was about. There was interest in reducing the former slaves to a servile status where you might work much as a serf, connected with the land or with a particular station you had had previously, but you would not be able to go on to move to act as an independent person. The question of race will probably be the most important question, political question, social question, economic question in the coming century. The 20th century will see the issues of race in America as central to how we conduct ourselves, who we are. America is a great nation, a great nation. We have 120 million citizens. Last year, it was declared we were the most productive nation on the planet. Our hamlets and villages and towns and cities are linked by more than 200,000 miles of railroads. We have the most railroads of any nation on the planet. But there are problems we have to face. Our economy is large and it's growing, and I'm sorry to say it may be growing because of this great conflagration that has struck the European nations. The mother countries of our civilization, England, France, Germany, are at war with each other. It's a great war. The values, the products, the benefits of the industrial age, the machine age, have been harnessed to make war, to kill our fellow man. Death reigns from the air. Great fleets hide in bays, in harbors, on oceans, hunting for each other, lurking, as it were, so that the power of industrialized production can hurl great explosives 15, perhaps 20 miles to destroy and kill our fellow man. And who are we in this day and age? Can we continue to be great? What is it that we are to do? What are we to become? How should we act toward each other? The people in New Hampshire appreciate freedom. You say that in your motto, live free or die. This was illustrated in the Revolution, very valiantly, gloriously. It was again illustrated after we had defined and satisfied our independence in 1776. We then had to redefine and constitute the meaning of freedom in 1861. And once again, New Hampshire answered the call. Much of what we are to do in the future will be the responsibility to ensure that all citizens, wherever they come from, because we have many immigrants, wherever they are going, because they will go into many areas, and we are expanding across this great nation. 15 years ago, the frontier was declared closed. Well, I've been to New Mexico and Arizona in my travels. I'm not so sure the frontier is really closed. What do your neighbors in Boston say? West of Dedham, what? Well, we are growing, we are building, we are developing. My school, Tuskegee, is part of that development. We want to be part, we want the Negro citizens in our country to be part of this growing America, this greatness that we are beginning to enjoy, this expansion we are seeking in industrialization. But we must understand the white population in America and the Negro population in America, that 90% of the Negro people in America are rural and Southern. 8/10 of those are sharecroppers. And what kinds of skills do sharecroppers need? What do they need to know? What do farmers need to know? They need to know agricultural science. We have at our institution Dr. George Washington Carver, who is busy every day as a practical scientist. Yes, he is a scientist, but a practical scientist. He tells agronomists, what it is they are to do when they study so they can teach farmers to be better at husbandry, at animal husbandry, at plant development and growth, at the creation of new crops, the development of hybrids that can grow better in our soils with our temperatures and around our country. We are doing many of these things at Tuskegee because we are trying to make a change. Well, sometimes, as you know, change is difficult. When I started at Tuskegee, I came from Hampton Institute where I was a teacher. I was recommended by General Samuel Chapman Armstrong to be the new principal for a normal school being developed in rural Alabama. The people of Alabama were expecting a white teacher to run the school, and they contacted Hampton for a recommendation. They were looking, no doubt, for someone who taught there that General Armstrong could recommend and whom they could place their trust. $2,000 was allocated for the creation of a school. However, this money was only for salaries. No money was allocated for buying land, building buildings, books, a library, all of the things that one would need to create a new institution. I arrived as the only teacher, no building. A borrowed church building was where we set up. That was the administrative office. That was the schoolroom, and later rooms plural. It was also the dormitory initially. There were 30 students ready that had been selected upon my arrival to join Tuskegee. They were selected for several reasons, but principally among them, they were accepted as students because they could be teachers. They could go out and teach the skills they were going to learn at Tuskegee. I am happy to say, since that day in 1881, with those 30 students and no buildings, that we have grown. We have prospered. We built buildings ourselves. We created our own farms, our own dairy, beef production. We grow the food that we eat. We now have 2,345 acres, 107 buildings, 200 faculty members, and more than 2,000 students. And we've done this since 1881. Now, much of that has been through the largesse of those who, through philanthropic means, have helped provide monies. That is a very good thing. We could not have grown so fast without their help and support. However, it means that as a teacher, as the principal of this normal school, now the president of the college we have named ourselves recently, I must travel 50% of the time most years, and sometimes even more. And I'm getting older. You can probably see that by just looking at me. My wife tells me I'm getting older all the time and complains. By the way, Professor Murray, my wife, is a member of the faculty. She directs the women's departments. My brother John is the head of industrial education. However, I do want you to know that there is no nepotism. My son also works with the university, my oldest son, and my younger son is going to. Recently, my wife is responsible for a building called Covent Hall. This is where the women's programs are headquartered, where her offices are. And as I was walking past, as I often do, I inspect the campus when I am on campus almost every day. I like to ride my horse Butler in the morning around the campus. I noticed that there were no flowers or neat shrubbery or gardening at this building. And through Mr. Sturm, my private secretary, I sent her a note, not as my wife, but as director of women's programs. And I told her I was disappointed upon my recent review of the buildings and grounds in her department. It did not meet the standards of Tuskegee. There were no flowers around the building. The shrubbery was in disarray. The grass was not cut. And I wanted this deplorable situation rectified as soon as possible. Well, now you can imagine such communications might have a deleterious effect upon my household happiness. It's not true. She understood her position as an employee. I received a 3-word reply: humph, humph, humph. Well, so much for working with your family at a large institution. I gave a speech, somewhat famous, only 5 minutes in 1895 at the Atlanta Exposition. This celebrated cotton coming back as being important in the American economy, the South coming back into the economy since the Civil War. It had taken until 1895 for Virginia, the richest state in the South, at the beginning of the Civil War, to have the same level of domestic product, the same economic production. It had taken 35 years to return. No other Southern state has done that as of yet, but we are moving in that direction. We are moving in that direction. So I was asked to come and talk about the participation of Negro citizens in this growth in the South. We were experiencing at this time in the South a return to a peonage. Segregation was rampant. New Jim Crow laws were being inactivated. The black codes that not allowing Negro citizens to ride on trains except in special cars, not to use public facilities, not to be able to buy houses, even those who were successful in certain neighborhoods. All of this was happening, and I realized that the struggle of Reconstruction had not been won. We were not considered open and welcomed members of the body politic. So I said to my fellow Southerners at this meeting, I understand that you are not happy with many of the things that have happened. They did lose the war. I understand that you have seen a change in your society that you do not necessarily appreciate, but 4.5 million Negroes live in the country. They are no longer slaves. If you want these citizens, these new citizens, to be criminals, to be non-productive, not to be integrated into the economic life of the country, then continue to segment and segregate and subjugate these citizens. But if you want prosperous citizens among you, participants with trades and professions that are useful to your growth, then you are going to have to welcome these new freedmen into your society. Now, wherever life is social, then we can act, black and white, as separately as the fingers of the hand. But where we need to work together to build and structure the society, we can be as the hand coming together to make America, and particularly the South, one. Well, most of my fellow Negroes agreed with me. A number of very famous people, Mr. W. Monroe Trotter, the editor of the Guardian newspaper in Boston, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, sent me a telegram of congratulations after I gave that speech. However, by 1905, when I published Up From Slavery, Dr. Du Bois had become critical of what he called the tainted bargain. Mr. Trotter published editorials against me and said that I did not recognize that if you did not agitate for your political rights, your full political rights immediately, then it made no sense to participate in American life. Well, I knew that white Southerners were not going to allow political participation without a great deal of violence. However, I did think if an economic successful, developed population of Negroes lived in the South, buying and owning land, farming, being in the trades, and allowing themselves to be part of this economic growth of the New South, that eventually they would be recognized positively as worthwhile citizens, making a contribution to the development of the society. Dr. Du Bois had a different idea. He felt that there was a talented tenth of the Negro population, of which I agree, that should receive a classical education. And many of my own students at Tuskegee over the years had talked about our lack of classics in the educational curriculum that we developed. The practical curriculum where we had people making bricks so that we could lay those bricks and build those 107 buildings I talked about. Learning how to be more productive farmers so that we could grow our own food at the college, feeding our students who were living there in dormitories, and selling food, selling meat, selling dairy products, selling eggs to the surrounding community to support ourselves and where the education was going. Now, some of my students asked why we were not learning Greek and Latin. And I was walking by a group of students who were working, mixing the clay for bricks one day, and I heard this discussion. And I asked the young man where he was from. And as I remember, it was some small hamlet in southern Alabama. And I asked him, well, in that place where you come from, had you heard anyone speaking Greek? Did anyone there talk about Greek philosophers? He said no to both questions. And then I asked, could they use carpenters in that town to help build houses? Could they use bricks to build kilns? Could they use metal workers, pipe fitters, better farmers? To which he answered yes. So I asked him, when you leave here, when you've completed, when you've been graduated from our institution, and you are going back to this place from whence you are from, you are going to work there. Are you going to use Greek in your work? Or will one of these practical skills, one of these trades, one of these professions that allows you to move economically through the society, to make money, to support your family, to buy land and become a productive citizen, would those skills be more valuable to you than speaking Greek? I didn't hear any more from him about speaking Greek. That was the end of those discussions. Well, Tuskegee has been a wonderful experiment, but I've been accused by Dr. Du Bois of the tainted bargain, and what he means is that giving up the struggle for immediate political rights meant that Negroes in America could not integrate into the body politic. I had no intention that political rights would be thrown asunder. My intent was that we were going to proceed to join the economic life in America first and foremost, and then proceed to the political rights with a sound basis in economy. In 1901, I founded the National Negro Business League. This was the first time this had been done. It included some of this talented tenth that Dr. Du Bois and Mr. William Monroe Trotter talked about. They had not done so. Neither of them joined or participated, I might add. And they criticized my book in the same year, Up from Slavery. 9 years later, they founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which was designed only to focus on political rights, but it did not address the economic inequities that existed in the country at the time. I asked in editorials, I asked Mr. Trotter why it was he thought there was something wrong with what I was doing, why he thought that the Negro population, 9 out of 10 in the South, should not strive to do better in this agrarian society where their skills and talents could be put to use and they could be paid for these skills, and look at politics first, which was not going to feed anyone. And there was a violent backlash. Now, I asked him if he thought that his scheme would work where I lived. I've often thought that if I lived in Boston, I might have Mr. Monroe Trotter's attitude. I might think that politics was more important, that that's what we should work on right away. However, I would offer to him that if he lived in rural Alabama, perhaps working in the industrial trades and training our large mass of Black citizens to work in these areas where they could make a living, where they would be admitted, would not be a better scheme for us to proceed. I've had no answer from Mr. Monroe Trotter. Now, I feel that that Monroe Trotter and W.E.B. Du Bois are frustrated aristocrats. Why, Dr. Du Bois was born not too far from here in Great Barrington. He's not even born in a place called Barrington. It had to be great. Just Barrington wasn't big enough to contain all of his wonderful ideas. I don't know of anyone he's put to work other than his students. I don't know of anyone who has been able to buy a house, to buy a farm, to structure a business listening to Dr. Du Bois or Mr. Monroe Trotter. Mr. Monroe Trotter's newspaper, and he was successful as a real estate broker in Boston, but his newspaper was purchased by money he inherited from his father, who was a tradesman. So I would like to know how it is they think they are going to be effective. Now, they've accused me of having the Tuskegee machine, that the philanthropists who are willing to support my efforts will give money, and 25 normal schools have been founded for the former freedmen to be able to be educated, to learn the industrial trades, and that I have prevented monies from being donated to other efforts, schools with a more classic bent in terms of their education that would educate these talented tenth that Dr. Du Bois and Mr. Trotter talk about. Well, that's not true. That's not true. I can't imagine Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Ford, or Mr. Huntington saying to me, Dr. Washington, are there places we should not donate funds to help people, poor colored people, come up in our society and do well? Do you think that we should stop W.E.B. Du Bois and Monroe Trotter from writing and talking about their schemes for race improvement and betterment? Do you think that's what we should do? Do you really think millionaires come and talk to me about where their money should go? Actually, I wish they did, because I've got lots of ideas, but that hasn't happened. Well, I am only visiting here for a few days. It's a quiet visit. I am going on to New York and talking to a number of people about fundraising, and I certainly appreciate being asked to say a few words while I'm here, but it is after church where we were this morning, and I know people have things to do, but if there are perhaps a few questions I could answer before I depart, I'd be more than willing to talk to the audience. Is there something you'd like to ask me? Would anybody like to make a donation to Tuskegee? After all, I am a college president looking for money for my school. Yes, sir.
I'm wondering how you see the relationship between your project at Tuskegee and the political advancement of African Americans, and on what time scale, and how would you sort of see the learning of trades, the participation in the economy, ultimately resulting in sort of political equality over time?
Now, sir, I don't know you, but that sounds like the sort of question a professor would ask. Well, I don't see any competition between myself and Dr. Du Bois at all. I think economic improvement, participating in the society as a responsible, law-abiding, successful citizen is something every Negro citizen and every white citizen should consider paramount. Given the vicissitudes of the 300 years of chattel slavery, our Black citizens do not necessarily have the wherewithal to start into the society at anything but the bottom level. They're going to have to be successful as farmers. Then from the farm, you make enough money, you can grow a business. From the business, you can make investments, you can buy property, and so on. That will happen in the natural course of things. Now, that may take a generation or two. We have certainly seen progress since the end of the Civil War. Things are better in some areas. The political power that is shared among citizens, it's something jealously guarded, and where you had someone who was willing to keep you in slavery, then fight a war to keep that system, changing that's a difficult process. It's going to take some time. Yes, it should happen. I want that to happen. I'd like to work towards it. I don't see a problem between us, that we can develop industrial education and we can have that talented tenth getting their classical education. After all, Dr. Du Bois is a graduate of Harvard. He is an eminent sociologist. He studied in Germany. He is a mentee of Professor James at Harvard. He knows all of the people with ideas about expansion and change that I think we're going to see more of in the 20th century. And I would think that many of his ideas are going to come to fruition. I have nothing against them. I am all for them. I hope that answers that. There was another question, I believe. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to phrase this question. If the freed Blacks had come together as a group and organized as, instead of all working individually, as sharecroppers. I mean, the Southern economy depended on Black labor and then sharecroppers. And if they had refused to work as sharecroppers and instead used some of the money available to Tuskegee to organize, would that have changed the course of their economic well-being?
I think that's an interesting suggestion. Let me point out that 50% of the farmers, of the white farmers in the South, are also sharecroppers. If they had come together and organized, could that have changed this old plantation system going to a small farm, the kind of America that Jefferson talks about in Notes on the State of Virginia, where the individual farmer, you buy a little more land if you have a larger family so that you can produce for yourselves. That isn't how America has developed. That isn't how we've grown. We've been successful because we have developed our industry. And unfortunately, for sharecropping, the South did not have, Black or white, did not have capital for individuals, Black or white, to buy small plots of land to afford this. Sharecropping is a system of credit. The person who owns the land, who's cash poor, can't sell the land to anyone. The land is no good unless it's being used. So how do you get the labor at a low cost without capital already amassed to make that land productive? And the sharecropping system is the way that the South has been able to farm out, if you'll pardon the pun, to farm out their land and make it productive without cash. And of course, there wasn't a lot of political talent. You know, how do you get things organized without communications, without money, without organizations? Slave organizations were few and far between for obvious reasons. Where there were slave revolts, and Virginia in particular did not allow reading after the Nate Turner uprising in 1834. And of course, many of the other states followed suit. So the organization would have been very difficult, but certainly a good idea, a good idea. Yes, sir.
Dr. Du Bois.
Well, he's not here today. In fact, he wouldn't even
I'm
like
sorry.
to be here if he knew I was on the stage.
No, he's okay. I'm referring to Dr. Du Bois about his road and his political thing. And the other side of the fence, where that you talk about trade, you have to have politics if you're going to get rid of the Jim Crow laws in the South. Politics is necessary. There's no way in the world you can get around that. Now, would you like to expound on that, please?
Well, I have no argument with you. I think that's absolutely true. The first Negro senator, Blanche K. Bruce from Louisiana, was an excellent man. Blanche K. Bruce. Sir? No, he grew up in Louisiana. He grew up in Louisiana, but he came across the border in his political career. His wife, Mrs. Bruce, is on our faculty. She is our singular political scientist. She writes about politics all the time. I hired her. I encourage her. I think voting is absolutely critical for any citizen to appreciably operate in the society. The problem is, how do you do that if you can't read, if you're hungry? You need to be able to make a living. And there are other people who are doing politics. I'm not telling anyone to stop. I'm just saying you have to have a skill. You have to participate in the society in a way that allows you to eat every day. I've never seen anyone eat a vote.
But you got to be able to vote.
Yes, sir. I don't agree. I have no disagreement with that.
There's an old joke floating around here in Mississippi, Alabama about this black guy go out to vote, and this guy said, "Can you read this Constitution?" He looked at it and he said, "Look like to me, read it. Looks like it in Chinese."
I can't do
And
everything.
the guy says, "Look like ain't no black guy gonna vote here today."
Yes, sir. Well, I teach the skills that are going to allow people to participate, and they will be able to vote when they can read, when they have money, when they're able to operate. But I made my dedication to economic betterment initially.
Born in the South, North Carolina, and my father always voted. But in the neighborhood that he voted, that he lived in, 99% of the black people didn't vote.
I'm sorry, 99% did not vote. Yes, sir. Understand. But if you are a citizen who's respected, you have property and land and influence, I think your political rights could better be protected. I can't imagine political rights without economic strength. I don't think that's possible. That doesn't exist for anybody in this society. You think a poor immigrant who comes with no money has economic rights denied and then is able to participate, to run for office, to vote, and to be successful? That isn't how the system works. We have to live with the reality we have, not with what we want. Who knows? Things may be better soon. I've seen lots of change since 1865 when I was a 9-year-old boy. No one would have thought I'd be president of a university in 1865.
Could you be the president of the University of Alabama?
Maybe someday. But I'm not sure I'd want that. I'm happy at Tuskegee. Other questions?
So how did you become president of Tuskegee? So how did you raise the funds and the money? And
Well, I started the school.
yeah, how did you start the school? I know you got $2,000 for salaries, but how did you convince someone to actually trust?
So how did we grow? What happened? Well, there were a couple of things. One, we had to buy land. If we were going to build, we couldn't live in the church forever. And that was a loan. Remember, this was an ongoing church. And as you can imagine, the pastor, after a few months, thought, there were beds, in the church. There were tents around where students were being billeted. They were living there. I was at the office every day, which was his church. We had to build buildings, and we needed to borrow money. The treasurer of Hampton Institute loaned us some money from Hampton's endowment. He also, because he was wealthy himself, he made a personal loan so that we could buy an initial small farm of 200 acres, which is how we got our start. So we built from there. We built a successful farm. We made money selling farm products. We put that back into more land, more buildings. Students were taught carpentry skills, bricklaying skills. We built our own buildings, most of them. Of that 107 buildings, so we built almost 100 of them without any outside help. So the students were taught these trades. Then we built the buildings. Then we operated the business of the farm, and students studied business by looking at what we were doing on the farm. Students who studied agriculture with Dr. Carver actually worked as the farmers on the product, raising the animals, doing all the things we had to do. We were successful because we worked and we invested in ourselves to build this institution. And it's taken, 34 years to get where we are now. And hopefully we're going to do a lot more if people are generous in New York. And I ask again, if anyone wants to make a contribution, I am collecting for the university. Yes, ma'am, you want to make a contribution? Now, that's...
Don't have my wallet. How were your students selected?
Our students are selected on the basis of their ability to teach. We want people who want to work, who want to understand these things, but we're a normal school. So it's not so much on you being successful, but can you teach other people to be successful? My philosophy is very simple. We learn to work. We work to improve. And when we improve, we spread that to our entire Negro community everywhere, not just the South, but everywhere that people are interested. So that's the kind of student we're looking for. Oh, absolutely. Yes, I said the second professor to come, the second teacher to come was Olivia Davis, who became my second wife. Later, she ran the women's program. So women were there from the very beginning. Our students were of all ages. We had students as young as 16, and we had some that were as old as 70. Some had families. So sometimes we had a husband and wife as students together. Because when slavery was over, we had to take the students where they were. I couldn't say, are you prepared to go to Harvard? As your reading and your classical education at such a level, you could be admitted to an exclusive school. I had to take people who could hardly understand English. And we had to bring them to a level where they could function in the society and be very successful at whatever they chose to do. Mostly from the South. We concentrated, more than half are from Alabama, but all over the South. And we do have students from other parts of the country, and we have some foreign students. We have some students from overseas. The Caribbean principally, but a number of places from Africa. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yes, the better class of white Southerner appreciates what we do and hires many of our graduates. So our graduates go back to work in the towns and villages they're from. They are hired by the people there with money, which is the white population that recognizes you need skilled labor to have a functioning economy. So absolutely. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, the year it started, yes, 1881. That's correct. In 1891,
predominant.
yes, sir, some of those places I haven't heard of.
I'm sure you heard of North Carolina A&T.
Yes, I've heard of that, but some of the other you mentioned, I haven't.
Came about in 1891. I'm just curious. Now, land grant college is pretty much like Tuskegee. They own vast amount of land. This is where the land was bought by the state and by the federal.
Well, sir, land grant colleges have nothing to do with the land they own.
Okay.
This is from the Morrill Act in 1863, which designated land-grant colleges to be places of research and improvement of animal husbandry and farming to make an industrial education to make the country better and stronger in those states that did not have many of their own institutions.
There's two land grant. There's one for the white colleges that came about, land grant, in 1850, like North Carolina State. Then the other one came about, like North Carolina A&T.
There might be somebody along in a few minutes who might be able to better discuss that. We might see somebody else that I'm afraid I don't know some of those answers.
What I'm getting at here is that when the land grant passed in 1891, I'm trying to figure out how that affect Tuskegee, because it should have, some money should have came their way for purchase of land and building.
Yes, sir. I'm afraid I can't answer that, but there may be somebody later who can talk about that.
Yeah, we need to keep our questions for Booker T. Washington, but in a moment.
Any
Have
other
anybody else
questions
for Booker
I can
T.
answer?
Washington?
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being with you today.
So your question can be answered by him and Booker T. Washington. Okay, so
1890 Land Grant University.
Character, you take something off of your costume, so you present yourself as the scholar to talk about things modernly. It's a family audience, so coat and tie, that's all I'm taking off.
Yeah.
There's not going to be anything else.
before, I'll introduce you
Yes.
as the scholar, and then you can ask questions of Dr. Armstead, who can answer things that Booker T. Washington couldn't answer, because he can only, before he could only answer the questions in the frame of knowledge that the historic character could have. But now, Booker T. Washington has left the stage, and now it's 2022. We know a lot more. A lot of things have happened, and this is Dr. J. Holmes Armstead, and he knows a whole lot more too. Than he's a retired professor.
I'm younger and better looking than Booker T. Washington. Too.
Okay. He's a retired professor of strategy and international law from the U.S. Naval War College. So, like, after this event's over, and you're sticking around, or in our break when we're having pie and brownies, you could ask him questions about a lot of different things. But right now, we can ask him questions about his scholarship of Booker T. Washington and the period of time. So, if you want to, anybody have any other questions for Dr. Armstead?
Yes, sir. Did it work?
Did it work?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Yes and no. In certain small towns, certain areas where labor was absolutely critical, I would say yes. Did it work as a scheme for advancing America and changing politics? Generally, no. And my answer to this would be, look at 1929 at the Great Flood on the Mississippi River. Laws were passed by many states because lots of whites left. I mean, the Delta is dangerous, it floods. And isn't it interesting that the original flood control on the Mississippi River was designed out of the St. Louis office of the Army Corps of Engineers that was run by a young lieutenant colonel named Robert E. Lee in the 1840s. So it didn't work. And what happened is the southern states made laws that blacks couldn't leave. So they were put into camps, like army camps, and you could work on building levees and work on the floods, but you couldn't leave and go north, because once the flood subsided, who was going to work the land? So Louisiana and Mississippi, Arkansas, they weren't going to let you leave. So that's what the lack of voting did. You didn't have a representative at the state level or at the federal level who would say, that's peonage, that's serfdom. Now, the Russians got rid of the serfs in 1862, under Alexander II, but the United States still had slavery when this was going on, and it essentially legally reinstituted serfdom during the Jim Crow days, and 29, you can't leave the land. How can you be tied to the land and have your constitutional rights? Yeah, it makes no sense. So I would say as a political change, no, it didn't work. As an economic change and improvement in the South in certain places, sporadically it was successful, but you needed both. You needed both. And these two men couldn't see that with each other. America wasn't a big enough political, educational, social, economic sphere in which they could struggle, see the value of each other, and be able to move ahead. They should have. They should have. You know, MacArthur and Patton, there wasn't enough war for them. You couldn't have them in the same theater. You know, it's as big as World War II. So it's not the first time we've had this problem with large egos. Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with Berea College in Kentucky?
No, I don't.
Berea.
Berea.
Yeah, so
I don't know
it
them. No,
was
sir.
a biracial college founded by anti-slavery people following before the Civil War, and a work-study program. But liberal arts college as well with
Yeah. Well, there were a number of those around. There were Wilberforce in Ohio. There were several, but I don't know that particular one. I don't know their story. I do know some good bourbon comes out of Kentucky, though. I was an armor officer, so I spent a lot of time at Fort Knox. I didn't drink when I went there.
So to take that question in a different direction. So,
Yes, ma'am.
The Tuskegee School emphasized practical.
This is another professor, by the way, so you have to be very careful when these professors ask questions.
Emphasize practical skills, right? And so the gentleman who just asked the question was about a liberal arts school. And in the way that you talked about liberal arts education, I get the impression that this was not very much appreciated at Tuskegee. So I wonder how you see this.
I wouldn't say Washington was against liberal arts education. He thought practical skills was more important first. Then we'll have those other things. Okay. However, he was not able to come to terms with Du Bois and Trotter to, you work on yours, I'll work on mine. They can be segmented in a way that we can work together. Because they did work together. Du Bois was offered a job at Tuskegee and would have accepted, but he had a letter in Germany. He already had a letter accepting Wilberforce, and he honored his commitment to that. But he would have gone to Tuskegee because it was considered a more advantageous place for a social activist to be.
So did they teach other liberal arts classes at all?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that happened. Not right away, but that happened eventually. Yeah, by 1915, there were certainly liberal arts programs, and you got degrees in business, for example, and other areas. You could study literature, but the focus in the beginning, we're talking about students who arrive, who are reading, who don't read at all, or reading at a very low level. So how do you make them fit into the society? That was his problem.
How did instruction, if you don't know, that's fine, but how did instruction actually take place if you were meeting a population that is perhaps...
You mean the physical construction?
Yeah.
You taught it. That's what he had learned at Hampton. Now, after he finished at Hampton with the same kind of education, he went to Wayland Seminary in Washington for a year thinking about theology. And he went off, he became a teacher, went back to Malden where he had grown up, and then General Armstrong called him back to Hampton and said, I'd like for you to come back and teach. Not only do you accept the idea of industrial education, but I think you'd be good teaching it. He did. Armstrong accepted that. Remember, the Indian schools were coming into play in the 1870s, and he asked Washington to make a tour out west, recruit Indians to come to Hampton, and then he was the director of the Indian school there for 2 years. So he had other things that were going on. I mean, he was a broad enough person, but this was a political fight, and he thought this had to be done first, and he was going to make sure of that.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Very little industrialization in the South and great migration.
That's why they lost the war.
But, so although they were now training people coming out of Tuskegee, where there's a lot of jobs available that people would hire them for, and was the great migration a result of all these people who needed work, and there just wasn't any work.
Okay, that's a very complex question. Now, let me go back a little bit. Let me answer the question I wish you had asked. Industrialization before the Civil War, how was that done? At the small level, slaves did industrial work on the plantation. You had to have metal work, you had to have blacksmith, industrialization at a low level. Then, of course, you move on to the next level, the machine age, it's coming in. There was 0 miles of railroad in 1828. There were 204,000 miles of railroad in 1901. So we don't have that many now. We're down in the 180s, I think, 185, 179, right there. But the expansion was tremendous. It was tremendous. One of the reasons why the South lost the Civil War, railroads. There were more railroads more companies in the South than in the North, but the railroads in the South ran east and west. See, they should have run, if you're defending the South, they should run north and south. You can get the appropriate military stores to the battlefront. You can move troops around, but they went sideways. So if you're evacuating Mississippi into Alabama, you could do it. If you're evacuating Kentucky and Tennessee into Georgia, and with Sherman after you, you don't have as much rolling stock and as many rails available to you to be able to do that. So the slave, because they didn't do any better. Remember, you're not going to work hard as a slave, graduate, and move on. Very small numbers, but you're not going to do that generally. So that means the skilled labor on the plantation were the slaves, the bricklayers, the blacksmiths, the masons, the people who did that, because you were there from the time you were a small boy and you worked until you died. So that's where that was. Now, in 2 industrial places in the South that were important during the war were Montgomery and Richmond. There were black workers who had been at a number of those factories before the war. But when the war starts, of course, do you trust a black worker when you're fighting to subjugate these people and keep them enslaved? So now you got to train lots of new people. You've got to bring them in from other places. There were immigrants. The South had immigration for not quite in the same number as the North, but there were a number of immigrants. There were some famous Southern generals who were immigrants, for example. So there's that. Now, up until the war, what's happening with those workers now? After the war, when you started training blacks to be industrial laborers, remember, lots of people were coming from the North now because there were opportunity. We have names for them. They're called carpetbaggers. So carpetbaggers were people who came, they had been in the South during the war. Albion Thurgee writes a very interesting book called A Fool's Errand, in which he talks about the kind of people that went south after the war. There were religious people who went south to help the freedmen. There were business people who went south because buying land was cheap. There were Northern politicians who went south to organize, going back to the very question you asked earlier, to organize blacks into the political process. Of course, these are Republicans who want the return for the war. I supported the war, my state supported it, et cetera. Now, how do we get something from that? So you go into this political organization to get that done. So you have all of this movement into the South and this agitation turning over. It's very poor. A lot of it's been destroyed. I mean, things are so bad. We talk about the number of people killed, and it's going up. We still have casualties today from the Civil War. So 619,000 is the official number. It's probably more like 775, because as we do the census data and we look at it well, if you got sick during the war, you came home and died within 6 months, you're a casualty. So we're just getting some of that information. So we've grown another 100,000 people in the last 40 or 50 years in death from the Civil War. And it would not surprise me if that gets to 800,000. That would not surprise me at all. So that's 20% more than what the official records were as we begin to look at this with modern techniques in historiography. So looking at these black workers who now develop more skills, could they move from the low level, that is doing the blacksmithing on a farm, to being the blacksmith in town? And the answer is yes. Could they move on to Richmond, which was industrialized? Richmond, Montgomery, the 2 industrial places. I mean, the reason why Birmingham, Alabama is named Birmingham because it has steel furnaces like Birmingham, England. That's where the name comes from the place. So you didn't get a lot of black workers going there because the new immigrants that were coming into the South from outside the country and from the North were taking those jobs. They were white. So you didn't need them. And, in the Southern social structure, you don't want blacks to move up and do well, no matter what the skill level is. So how high you got was much more important than how close you got. You could be my servant and work for me and dress me every day, but I don't want you moving across the street as a doctor, lawyer, or Indian chief. So that was the difference when we talk social differences north and south.
Black people.
Yeah, okay, I'd agree with that. Yeah, pretty much. But the Great Migration comes after, it doesn't start at 1915. The Great Migration begins about 16, 17. You have to have this fantastic expansion of industrialization to fight the war before you have a need for black workers. Remember, they had a need for workers. The industry expanded. You didn't go recruiting in the South for black workers. You had foreign workers come in. You had people that wouldn't have had the jobs before, the Irish, the Italians, Eastern Europeans. We had, in 1901, we had 1 million immigrants who were from what's called non-white nations, meaning Italy, Greece, and the Slavic countries. They were not called white at the time by the Immigration Society. So we had those people coming in. When the war starts, do you trust Germans and Italians to do things? We're fighting against Germans, and the Italians are kind of, what side are they really on? Remember, a lot of Italy was part of Austria-Hungary. Giuseppe Verdi, his first operas, his name is Josef Grun. He's German. His first operas are written in German because the part of Austria-Hungary he lived in was German control, German language was predominant. Austria-Hungary. After you change the country's boundaries, now he's an Italian. So what are you at that time? Well, this made Americans very nervous. So we had certainly, Budweiser beer had trouble in St. Louis in 1917 because the company that owns them, Anheuser-Busch, well, a German name. What do we want to do with that? The Zimmerman telegram, the Mexicans are talking to the Germans about getting California back. In Arizona they can have, in my opinion. But New Mexico and part of Texas, you fight with us or just start some trouble on the border, keep the Americans busy, we'll give you that back because we're going to win the war. So there's lots of social turnover, consternation. 1919, the war is over. We call it the year of the Red Scare. We had riots in 35 cities in America and race riots, but we also had immigration riots. We didn't trust people. Where were you when the war started? You've got this term, people change names, and this isn't just here. The royal family in England, they changed their name. Their name is not Windsor. Their name is Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And now with Prince Philip marrying into the family, it would be Saxe-Coburg-Gotha von Battenberg. The von Battenbergs changed their name in World War I. The first Sea Lord, Prince Louis of Battenberg, changed his name to Mountbatten and gave up his princedom and was given a title in England. The royal family changed its name. Windsor's a house, that's a castle. That is not the family's name. But it was a German royal family in England. I mean, this was going on all over the world. Lots of stuff. Anything else I can answer? Yes, sir.
Mr. Washington get involved in the founding of the NAACP?
No, it was founded in opposition to his business league and his political point of view. So his political adversaries, Monroe, Trotter, and Du Bois, were at the source of the founding. Oh, no, they weren't going to let him on board. Okay, if we found, I don't know if we have a historian, I'm not an historian, by the way. If a historian could find us some records, I wouldn't be surprised if the NAACP didn't have a hitman out. They were negotiating for a hitman to take him out because they thought they couldn't get money and do things because of what was called the Tuskegee machine. His political influence with philanthropists was keeping them from being funded properly. Yeah, they didn't want to make a deal. They were adversarial, wrongly adversarial, and it was personal, and some of it was very nasty. My comment about, Great Barrington, the little joke, well, that comes from, that's mine. But it comes from Washington saying Trotter and Du Bois are frustrated aristocrats. I mean, that's a quote. That's from him. They're frustrated aristocrats. Yeah, he saw himself as, representing the common man. But now in 1903, he spends 3 months in a castle in Scotland with Andrew Carnegie. So, and after that, every year he goes to Scotland with the Carnegies, so he wears his Kniebentosen and goes out shooting and golfing at St. Andrews. And he takes no salary from 1900 forward because Carnegie endows him personally. So he has his personal endowment, so he doesn't take salary for him or any of his family members working at Tuskegee. Yes, sir.
It's my opinion here is that all this dickering back and forth.
So keep the mic close to you. I can't hear you
Okay,
very
I
well.
got you. It's
And then we can
opi-
talk about land grants. Land grants are 1863, the Morrill Act.
No,
If you want to talk about, if you
no,
want to talk
this
about
is
how the
not-
country
this is-
changes. No, but I didn't answer that because I couldn't. You were asking about some things that are political developments after, Washington dies a week after this presentation I gave you. He dies on the 14th of November, goes to New York, has a stroke. His wife comes up, with an hour's notice by train. The doctors say he's had a stroke. You leave him here, we could save him. He says, I was born in the South, I'm going to die in the South. Take me home, goes home, dies 6 hours after he gets there. So political developments of schools that start and do other things as they grow later on, that's out of temporal juxtaposition with my character. So that's why I couldn't answer that. But I can certainly take on that now.
No, you're okay. What I was going to say is that all the dickering back and forth between Du Bois and Trotter and Washington and Carver and all this stuff, to me, it's a division among black leadership. And this has led to, and we have it today, and this has led to a weaker system, a weaker front. And it does indeed trigger a less and not effective process of fighting discrimination or racism in America. This is my opinion.
No organization, no group of people is going to have unanimity. I serve as an election judge overseas. I was in Kazakhstan when the recently deposed president, Mr. Azarbayev, was reelected. And it was 93% of the vote was in his favor. And in the report, the OSCE report, and I helped write part of it, I made a joking comment that in a family of 4, you can't get unanimity on where you take a vacation. 4 people aren't going to agree. The kids want to go to Disneyland. Mom and dad want to go to the beach. You're not going to get 93% of anything. So part of division in terms of direction, political, social, economic, in a group, I think shows sophistication. That the group is sophisticated enough that there are different people with different ideas of what they want to do. Having everybody on the same sheet of music and moving in the same direction, that means you're ignoring other possibilities. That would not be wise as a decision-making process to begin with, but there are more than one ways to skin a cat, no matter what the cat's like. So it's not necessarily a terrible thing. I think it's the ego of these 3 gentlemen, why they couldn't come together, and the fight shouldn't have been in public. It didn't have to be in public. They could have had that discussion among themselves. The black elite was not so large that they couldn't, take a train and get together, and there were meetings and groups and church groups, and that could happen. But what group doesn't have, look at America now. We're 50-50 to the far right and to the far left where we want to kill each other. If you look at January 6th, that's an example of the rift in American society and American thinking, how we solve our problems in the body politic as a whole. Why would blacks be any different? Well, there's a panacea that's way beyond my level of wisdom to solve that. Other questions? Things I can answer? Yes, sir.
Just a little technical point for future presentations in New Hampshire. The state motto, "Live Free or Die," as I understand it, was created in 1968. It was put on license plates in 1968 in response to anti-Vietnam War agitation. So that was the state's
Well, it was
response.
formalized, but it was actually used a good deal before that. I've seen it earlier. But the formalization, I wasn't aware of that, but,
As an official state motto?
right. Of course, in 1915, there weren't many license plates anyway. In 1901 in the state of Michigan, there were 2 registered automobiles. There were more cars, but 2 were registered. They had a head-on collision. So, licenses and, what happens there, we've got a lot of confusion. But thank you for that. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Of course, originally Vermont was part of New Hampshire. You owned it, like Virginia owned Tennessee and Kentucky.
I think that was debated. I think New York claimed.
Well, they argued that in Vermont.
Nobody
I
actually
understand.
wanted it.
They argued it over
Nobody
there.
wanted
Yes.
There was the Republic of Vermont.
Well, I'm not going to go to Vermont and say that. I will say that. But that was the original, and that was the Northwest Ordinance dealt with that.
So,
Well, thank you very much.
yeah, if there's no more
No
questions,